And so I want you to keep in mind that even though the modernists were rejecting those things, they were rejecting meter and rhythm and rhyme, it didn't happen all at once. So these poems are still pretty early in the period, and as we progress further and further through this section, you'll start to see that they become less and less traditional. This first poem by Siegfried Sassoon is called The Glory of Women, and you'll notice, if you take a moment to examine the rhyming pattern and the number of lines, that we have here a sonnet. So sonnets are still popular even after the Renaissance is over, and poets are still writing sonnets in 2017. It's not totally unusual to see a sonnet here. Okay, so let's talk through this poem. Sassoon says, "You love us when we're heroes, home on leave." Now the you here is going to be women because that's what's referenced in the title. "You love us when we're heroes, home on leave, or wounded in a mentionable place." So think about that, what that means. Women love the soldiers who are heroes, right? And they like soldiers who are wounded, right? So it's kind of honorable to be seen with a soldier who's been injured in the glory of battle. But notice he says wounded in a mentionable place. So the women only love the men when they've been, wounded somewhere they can talk about. If they've been wounded somewhere gross, then the women don't care. "You worship decorations. You believe that chivalry redeems the war's disgrace." So here again, he's saying, these women during this time period are worshiping decorations. They want medals and valor and the, decorated soldier. And they still have this false idea that chivalry is somehow, good enough to make people forget that this war was disgraceful and meaningless. He says, "You make us shells." I think this is a really interesting line. So for me, I think he's saying, you make us hollow. You make us just these kind of outer shells or show pieces for people. "You listen with delight. You crown our distant ardors while we fight and mourn our laureled memories when we're killed." So basically you honor the soldiers while they're away, and then, you like to be seen mourning at their memorials or their funerals. He says, "You can't believe that British troops retire." So notice that he's put retire in quotation marks. So here he's saying, you don't believe that any British troop would just quit. Basically, since you believe in this kind of false valor or bravery or honor, basically you either believe that the British troops die, valiantly in battle, or they just stick with the war till it's over. But you would never think that a British guy would just say, "I don't want to fight anymore." "When hell's last horror breaks them and they run, trampling the terrible corpses, blind with blood." Listen to how ugly that is. It's not beautiful or honorable, right? So he's saying, you would never believe that a British troop would run when hell's last horror breaks him, right? Think about that. So he's been broken by the horrors of war, and he runs trampling the terrible corpses. So he's like running over other people's bodies. Remember, we said that during the modern period, poets are going to write about anything they want to, not just beautiful things anymore. He says, "O German mother dreaming by the fire, while you are knitting socks to send your son, his face is trodden deeper in the mud." So here we have a direct address to the German mother. So he's addressing women on both sides of the war, the British and the Germans. That's interesting. But he's saying, you're knitting socks to send your son, which, is such a sweet thing to do, but you're not thinking about what he's actually going through, this kind of disgusting, demoralizing battle that he's in. So overall, this poem is kind of saying, you guys like that old idea of war where, it's a bunch of knights with, gallant hearts and steeds. But really, this is a disgusting, disgraceful war. People are terrified. They're trampling over each other's bodies to get out. And meanwhile, these women are still back home with these really false ideas about what's going on. So remember again that we said during the modern period, we're going to see a lot of skepticism and disillusionment. So these guys no longer have any illusions that war is honorable. And that brings us conveniently to our next poem. This poem is called Dulce et Decorum Est, and that's a Latin phrase. I'm going to go ahead and translate it for you if you haven't already looked it up. Dulce et Decorum Est pro patria mori is the full line that ends the poem, and that line is a Latin phrase. It was developed during the high Roman period as a battle cry for Roman soldiers. And so it means it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. So Roman soldiers would kind of holler this out to get themselves amped up before they would go into battle, basically saying, if we die for our country, that was good and righteous and heroic. All right. And so that phrase, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, has been resurrected during the modern period. So soldiers are starting to see it on like recruitment posters for the military. So they're trying to use it again to recruit people and get soldiers excited about going to war. Like, don't you want to get to go serve your country? And wouldn't it be sweet if you got to die for your country? Wouldn't that be great and honorable? And so Wilfred Owen here has a poem to show us just how honorable it actually is when you get over there. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge. So listen to how ugly that language is. Even when you hear it, it's got all those hard B and K sounds, coughing, knock-kneed sacks. It's really ugly to listen to. It's violent almost. He's already used two similes. He said that the soldiers were like bent like beggars and they're coughing like hags. Hags and beggars are not noble, honorable images. He says, we cursed through the sludge till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and toward our distant rest began to trudge. So finally the soldiers are kind of getting to leave battle and make their way to a safe area to rest. He says, men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshod. So they're basically shod or shoed with blood because they don't have any shoes. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of disappointed shells that dropped behind. So these men are so tired and crippled and beaten down that they don't even hear the shells dropping behind them. They don't even care that bombs are dropping all around them. They're just kind of beaten down. But then a chemical weapon goes off. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. So here, as the chemical weapon explodes, the men are in a hurry, fumbling around to get their gas masks and their helmets on. And it says someone still didn't make it. There was some guy who didn't get his helmet on time, and he was stumbling and floundering. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a sea, I saw him drowning. So now we're going to have a description of the man who didn't get his mask on in time. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. Again, not a noble way to die, right? If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil's sick of sin. So we have here kind of an if-then statement. So he says, if you could walk behind the wagon we flung him in. So again, nothing honorable. They just flung his body in a wagon because they had to keep going. And the man's eyes and his face, he describes as being like a devil's sick of sin. So it's like the ugliest face that you can possibly imagine. And the if-then statement's going to continue. So if you could walk behind our wagon, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. So these sounds that he's making, and this blood gargling up from his lungs is just disgusting, obscene, bitter. So we have this if-then statement. If you could walk behind this wagon, if you could see his eyes, if you could hear the blood gargling out of his lungs, then, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. So Wilfred Owen says here, if you could see what this war is really like, you wouldn't tell young men desperate for glory that it's sweet and fitting to die for their countries. There is nothing sweet and fitting about what these soldiers are going through. If you go back and look at this poem, it's a longer poem, but this section here that you see, you'll notice that you have a sestet, an octave, 8 lines here, and then a sestet. So it's kind of a sonnet. You can even see that it has the rhyme scheme of a sonnet: sack, sludge, back, treads, boots, blind, hoots behind, then thumbling, time, stumbling, lime, light, drowning. So we have kind of a sonnet here. Then we have this little kind of mini stanza that's on its own. And then we have at the end another sonnet sequence. So this poem is kind of like 2 sonnets that are linked together. Very interesting. Okay, now finally we're going to get a poem from Ezra Pound. I put it all on one page in columns so it'd be easier for us to read. Ezra Pound, as I mentioned in the Modernism PowerPoint, was one of the leaders, really the leader of the modern period. And he was the one who really pushed for free verse, verse libre as he called it. So you'll notice that this poem by Pound does not rhyme and it does not have rhythm. He rejected rhyme and rhythm completely. This was a longer poem called Hugh, Selwyn, Moberly, which is kind of it's like a poem that tells a story about this fictional soldier, this guy named Hugh, Selwyn, Moberly, and it follows him through his experience fighting in the war. So I just pulled out a couple of sections for you. Number 4, the 4th section here says, "These fought in any case, and some believing pro domo in any case." So pro domo it's Latin for their home, like for their homeland. Okay, so some of them thought or believed that they were fighting for their homeland. Some quit to arm, some for adventure, some from fear of weakness, some for fear of censure, some for love of slaughter, in imagination, learning later. So these are all the reasons that some guys might fight or go to war. Some of them might really want to have an adventure. Some of them are afraid of looking weak, or some of them are afraid of being punished or censured. He says some in fear, learning love of slaughter. So some of them go, even though they're afraid, but they become kind of monsters when they go to war. They learn to love killing. Died some pro patria, non dulce, non et decor. So he's playing there with that phrase that Wilfred Owen just used in his poem. Remember, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. Pound here is saying, died some for their countries, but not sweetly and not fittingly. So he's saying, again, that's a lie. Some walked eye deep in hell, believing in the old men's lies. Then, unbelieving, came home. Home to a lie, home to many deceits, home to old lies and new infamy. Usury, age-old and thick, and liars in public places. So he's saying you left the hell of war, and then they came home to a society that was also corrupt, a society that also had lost its morals and values. So there's really nothing left for these guys. It says they came home to deceits, lies, usury, which is like money lending or cheating people with money. Daring as never before, wastage as never before, young blood and high blood, fair cheeks and fine bodies. So he's saying, young men die, it's a waste. High blood means even noble people, like noblemen died. Fortitude as never before, frankness as never before, disillusions as never told in the old days, hysterias, trench confessions, laughter out of dead bellies. I love that image, even though it is kind of haunting, that laughter out of dead bellies. I'm not totally sure I know what it means, but I often think of either it's a guy who's basically sure to die because he's in a deadly battle and he's laughing the night before to try to make light of it. Or sometimes I think, maybe it's a guy who's been shot in the belly and he's kind of like laughing through it because there's nothing left to do. It's all so terrible. There died a myriad, and of the best among them, for an old bitch gone in the teeth, for a botched civilization. So ultimately, he said, all of these people died, and the best among them too. So we don't even know how many brilliant geniuses we lost in this stupid war. He compares